On the 20th of May, 1939, Chikuma was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy, and though it was not apparent at the time, it would end up being the final heavy cruiser commissioned into the Navy. 5.5 years later, on the 22nd of October, 1944, Chikuma would sortie as a part of Cruiser Division 7, which included Tone, Suzuya, and Kamano, on what would become its final mission, as 3 days later, on the 25th of October, 1944, it would be caught in the Battle off Samar. By the time the confusing Battle of Samar was completed, the Japanese had lost track of Chikuma, and the ship was listed as missing in action, and even up to today, its wreck has still not been discovered. Even though the ship went missing in action, it is still possible to reconstruct its final hours using accounts from the Japanese perspective up to the point when the ship was lost, and then from there on out using accounts from the United States perspective. At 6:58 a.m. on the 25th of October, 1944, Force A, better known as Kurita Center Force, opened fire on Taffy 3. At 8:50 a.m., Tone observes 4 TBF Avenger torpedo planes zoning in on Chikuma, and 3 minutes later they would drop their payloads in an anvil attack, 2 to starboard and 2 to port. Chikuma evades to starboard, dodging those 2 torpedoes, and it dodges 1 from port, but the second strikes the after quarter. Tone's after-action report describes Chikuma's stern as sagging, though, based on photographic evidence, the more appropriate term would be that the stern was severed. A few minutes after the torpedo struck, Tone observed that the rudder disable signal had been raised, and at 9:07, Chikuma radioed Yamato, informing Kurita that it was unable to maneuver. At 9:20, it radios Yamato again and states, 1 propeller, speed 18 knots, unable to steer. This radio signal is vital as it tells us the condition of the ship's stern following the torpedo hit. 3 of the 4 propellers had been blasted off. The one that was most likely intact was the outboard starboard propeller, and the rudder was gone. At 9:40, Chikuma would radio Tone, giving it its final position and stating, speed 9 knots, request for heading. Admiral Kurita would not receive Chikuma's final message until 10 a.m., and by that point, all contact with cruiser had been lost, and the Japanese would never hear from Chikuma again. At 11:05 a.m., 5 TBF Avengers from the Kikun Bay spotted a Japanese battleship and cruiser. They also spotted a cruiser circling slowly in the background and selected it as the target. 4 of the 5 Avengers would participate in another anvil attack, 2 to port and 2 to starboard. The cruiser is described as evading to starboard, and it would dodge both torpedoes on that side, but both of the torpedoes dropped on the port side would strike it amidships. After the torpedo struck, a large column of smoke was observed rising from the ship's port side, and it immediately began to lose speed. The 5th Avenger attempted a torpedo run, but was shot down by the cruiser's anti-aircraft, and by this point, the cruiser was noted to be at a full stop. Based off the facts that the torpedoes were observed to have struck amidships, and that the cruiser came to a halt, the torpedoes hit the propulsion system, whether it be boilers or the turbines themselves. Jumping back to the Japanese, at 11:10 a.m., just 5 minutes after the torpedo attack had occurred on Chikuma, Kurita decides to dispatch the destroyer Nowaki to locate and assist Chikuma. Nowaki detaches from Force A, and it too would never be heard from again. At 1400, 3 TBF Avengers from the USS Omani Bay spotted a cruiser dead in the water, and it was leaking oil, with a destroyer roughly 1,000 yards astern of it, and there was another battleship in the background. It was decided to drop all 3 torpedoes on the immobilized cruiser and finish it off, and this was done at roughly 14:10. All 3 torpedoes were dropped on the port side, and all 3 reportedly hit. There was very light anti-aircraft resistance, and smoke immediately rose from the cruiser as its port list increased. There were 3 photographs of the cruiser taken following these 3 torpedo hits, and of the 3, there was one that is clear, and it shows that it was in fact the Chikuma that was selected as the target. The Avengers stayed on site until the cruiser sank at roughly 14:30, with it described as going down port stern. The story does not end here, as Chikuma undoubtedly dumped survivors into the water, and the destroyer Nowaki was left behind to collect all of them. At 1700, Admiral Kirita orders the destroyers assisting the cruisers Chikuma and Chokai to rejoin the main fleet, as by this point they were falling back to the San Bernardino Strait after having suffered a disastrous day in battle. The United States, having learned that the Japanese were falling back to the San Bernardino Strait, sent Task Force 34, also known as Halsey's cruisers, to block his retreat, though they arrived too late. A few minutes before 1 a.m. on the 26th of October, a lone destroyer was spotted entering the strait, and Halsey's cruisers opened fire. By 1:35, torpedoes were dropped, and one was observed to have struck the destroyer, which resulted in it sinking. All hands were lost. The destroyer would later be recognized as having been the Nowaki carrying Chikuma's survivors. So, by the end of the battle, no survivors were recovered from Chikuma, and no survivors were recovered from the Nowaki. What happened to Chikuma and Nowaki was well summarized in Cruiser Division 7 After Action Report. At 11:10, Nowaki was ordered to proceed to Chikuma and screen her, but the subsequent fate of both ships is unknown. It is believed that all hands met a heroic end. What occurred aboard Chikuma and Nowaki will never be known, since there were no survivors from either ship, but, based off timelines and surviving accounts, it is possible to at least reconstruct their final movements. With that having been said, there is nothing more to add on to the topic for today. So, if you have learned something new, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.